leg locks, and apologies, because I'm going to use the term so many times that it loses meaning, exist in an interesting set of contradictions between submission grappling and mixed martial arts. In high-level no-gi, the entire meta has had to change to accommodate the leg lock game, mostly consisting of heel hooks and defenses to leg entanglements. The last time I checked, the heel hook was the most often finished submission in top-level competition, which marks a serious departure from any time before the late 2000s to early 2010s. John Danaher and his Death Squad are of course amongst the most influential figures in this shift towards the leg lock game, but there are others of course. To sum all of this up, leg locks are here in the no-gi meta, whether you want to play them or not. And now we're in an era where even a wrestler like Nicky Rod has an incredibly well-developed skill set around leg locks, as he primarily focuses on defending them so that he can get back to his A game, which is unga bunga grappling after my own heart. Prior to the popularization of the leg lock in jiu-jitsu, half of the human body was effectively being ignored as a target, and thus we now exist in a much more developed game. Some of the reasons for the prior lack of leg locks can be credited to the Gracies and their distaste for leg attacks dating back to classism against lucha libre fighters of all things, but this is not a video on the history of jiu-jitsu. In MMA, the state of leg locking is very different, mostly due to this thing known as getting punched in the fucking head. While there are exceptions, in most high-percentage leg attacks, you surrender bottom position if it fails, especially if you enter with something like an Imanari roll. Unless you have a guard like Prime Tony Ferguson, Charles Oliveira, or our Lord and Savior Alexandre Pantoja, you're most likely going to be losing if you're laying on your back. Submissions also become harder to secure in MMA gloves, so in going for a leg lock entry, you're often taking an extreme risk to maybe score a submission. Another factor is mental. When in a leg entanglement, one can either decide to attack a submission of their own if it's 50-50, or otherwise reverse it into a leg lock, or they escape, with the highest percentage version normally being to stand back up and stack your opponent to break the grip while making sure to hide your heel and knee line to stay safe. Now of course, the submission grappling of this version is very technical, as if you try to brute force your way up in a haphazard manner, you're going to end up heel hooked from the front, or even heel hooked from behind, as you're in the middle of completing the mistake. In MMA, however, this situation is very different. Firstly, some MMA fighters are psychotic enough to just ignore the leg lock, something men like Don Fry and Jim Miller have done before. Adding to this, whereas one person could have hundreds to thousands of grappling matches, one can only have so many MMA fights, so there are higher stakes here. Thirdly, if one postures up enough to face their opponent, one can simply bounce their head off the mat with strikes until they let go. Much like someone on offense attacking a joint lock can punch someone defending well until they offer up a limb, something I highlighted in my Tony Ferguson study, one can do so on defense by hitting someone until they release the hold. If you're using your arms to attack or defend a submission, you aren't using them to defend your head or body from strikes. In summary, you're taking a lot of risk to apply a technique inherently disadvantaged by the rule set, but of course, one can make it work. Ryan Hall, the Wizard, is of course a shining example, going 5-1 in the UFC. Unfortunately for him, that many hours being put into just grappling meant his striking was less developed, which led to a knockout loss to the tormentor of my hopes and dreams, Small Top Turo. He also just didn't have the wrestling to consistently impose a leg entanglement any way other than rolling for a leg, which once again surrenders a bad striking position, even if you're good at grappling off your back. This general state of affairs led me to a fascination with a different leg locker, one Rousimar Palhares. Due to reasons we'll get into later, Palhares rarely ran into the same problems as other leg lock specialists, both due to his powerful if rudimentary striking, and the fact that he had a legitimate takedown acumen that didn't have to roll into a kamikaze charge in order to get a hold of the leg. Today I'd like to look through various fights of his career in order to analyze what made his system work, what made it fail, and just generally have fun watching an endlessly fascinating fighter. As a note, some fights I couldn't get footage of or were just bored by, so I didn't want to make this repetitive, so if a fight is skipped, it's one of those two reasons. Now, the elephant in the room that must be addressed before we get into the study is the character of Rousimar, who famously held onto holds far longer than necessary after winning a fight, injuring his opponents. This is very bad, and his firings from several promotions because of said actions were all well deserved. That being said, I still find his grappling interesting, because it isn't as if he was a fighter who was cheating to win, he was cheating to lose. He would win with his far fucking superior grappling, and then fuck himself over with his conduct afterwards. I think the fact that he made leg locks so viable is worth analyzing, as his general game plan could be a blueprint for future submission grapplers with a leg lock heavy game plan transitioning to mixed martial arts. Shout out to Gary Tonin and One for making leg attacks viable, albeit against much lower level of competition as well. But without further ado, let's look at the career of Rousimar. The first fight I can find footage of from Rousimar is versus Fabio Nascimento. Sorry, there could be some Brazilian names I fuck up in here. In the first round of a one-night tournament in Fury FC in Brazil. Palhares has the nickname Toquinho, once again, probably mispronouncing that, which means little tree stump. And that's incredibly apt as he's approximately 4 feet tall and 10 feet wide, a marvel of modern steroid-based science. After opening with a head kick, Rousimar dives in on a double leg, finishing it with very little resistance. He almost immediately tries to hop over the guard upon landing, but is stopped. And it's honestly a great little trick to try and pass guard before his opponent has even properly reset. His opponent Fabio does a great job with his butterfly hooks, however, and he forces Rousimar back to his feet. Not trying to spend too much time striking, Rousimar grabs a high crotch that absolutely ragdolls Fabio, slamming him hard into the mat Daniel Cormier style. He stacks his opponent and defends an armbar intelligently, mixing in a few punches. Even as his opponent creates enough space to stand up, he lands a punch or two in transition. After a little bit of striking, Rousimar hits a beautiful standing back take against the ropes. From here, he rolls backwards and earns the finish with the heel hook. This fight is a really interesting tone setter because of how good his wrestling looks and his decision making. While it's not a grounded controlled position, he rolled for a leg lock from an advantageous one nonetheless, waiting for a standing back take before trying something that potentially risky. Everything aside from his striking looked incredibly crisp. Versus Daniel Acasio. Moving forward to his second fight of the one-night tournament, Rousimar seeks to secure the victory in the same way he did in the first. After a little under a minute of striking, he sets up the takedown in classical MMA wrestler fashion, following a jab to one side of the body with a shot on the opposite leg. Acasio defends well enough to get back to his feet, but gets rocked as Rousimar mixes in a punch, and ends up doing the chicken dance backwards into the corner. There, Rousimar reshoots and lands the takedown and lands on top of full guard. He stacks and then attacks the leg when Acasio extends his leg out, and although the other man rolls to try and escape, the finish is secured. Once again, Rousimar waited to secure an advantageous position before going for the leg, and even cleverly mixed in a punch to his takedown attempt that rocked his opponent and led to the actually completed takedown. The next fight brings us to his UFC debut against a member of Team Punishment in Ivan Salaverry, a somewhat forgotten MMA pioneer who popularized the crucifix in modern MMA. I do want to note that it's hilarious because I wrote this roughly a month or two before this video will go up, and Jack Slack actually mentioned Ivan Salaverry recently in one of his preview podcasts for UFC 317. After a kick that offers an incredibly short window to attack, Rousimar pounces nonetheless, shooting in before finishing the takedown with a trip that lands him in side control. Unlike many in MMA, Salaverry is incredibly defensively responsible for bottom side control, grabbing a head and arm grip from below and trying to get his knees back inside of Rousimar's to establish half guard. Palhares, however, is incredibly cognizant of that and continues circling forward amidst attempts to pass to mount, eventually getting that down. Salaverry immediately begins trying to buck and roll, which ends in Rousimar taking his back. Palhares then very methodically attacks the rear naked choke, keeping his feet connected but not crossed to make sure he can't be footlocked, and pummeling again and again for a good attack to the neck. Knowing he's losing the longer he stays there, Ivan springs up, but it proves to be his undoing. As Ivan is ripped backwards, Rousimar transitions to a half Nelson and then gets his right leg over his head in a split second, securing the armbar that wins him the fight. Palhares looks incredibly savvy here, and shows he's more than a one-trick pony with his leg locks, proving that the man is truly a submission artist beyond just a guy who spams a technique and prays for the best. For his next fight, Palhares takes a, quite frankly, absurd step up in competition, facing former Greco-Roman Olympian, Pride double champ, and Bonk Master Supreme Dan motherfucking, yes that's his middle name, Henderson, a middleweight who knocked out heavyweights on a semi-regular basis. Spoiler alert, Rousimar is not going to win, but if he can survive and even win a round, it's going to say very good things about his potential as a prospect. So without further ado, let's see how this goes. After confirming that Big Boy of Outcast is in attendance, the fight begins. After roughly 30 seconds, likely trying to avoid a Hendo kill shot after being crowded into the cage, Palhares shoots on a single that Hendo easily sprawls on. Hendo attempts to dive on him and drop a god-shattering hammer fist, but the active guard of Palhares works great against the frenzied ground and pound of Henderson, who overextends and gets his leg collected by Palhares. The threat is enough to get Henderson to let him back up, and thus he survives something many others wouldn't. Undeterred, Palhares keeps shooting and getting sprawled on. It's actually pretty smart in my eyes, as he wants to clinch at all costs, and each second he spends grappling isn't one spent getting his head pinballed around by Dan's Donkey Kong-style punches. It's not really a winning game plan, but one pretty well suited to minimizing the offense of a former world champion, and thus pretty sound. After all, he really only needs one slip-up by Henderson in the clinch to allow a deep leg entry, so biding his time isn't the worst idea. Unfortunately, he can't escape the brawl no matter how hard he tries, and Hendo just sort of shoves him over during a wild exchange with 2 minutes remaining. Once again, and I'll say this a lot, the active guard allows him to survive. Towards the end of the round, we get an incredibly fun scramble as Rousimar gets the best single leg he's gotten in the fight thus far, covering his entry with an overhand and then lawn darting himself in. Hendo tries to roll through and flip position, but the cage helps Rousimar hold the roll and stay on top. Hendo tries to go to an inverted triangle of all things / a head scissors, but the BJJ ace escapes and secures side control. Henderson manages to minimize damage for the rest of the round, and Palhares goes for a leg lock that's just too late. Henderson wins the round, but Palhares didn't look helpless either. In incredibly admirable fashion, Rousimar doesn't want to let Hendo get comfortable, and rushes his opponent almost immediately in the beginning of the next round, throwing a flurry of strikes that basically ends in a fucking powerbomb off a kick, but homeboy jumps right back up. At 4:15 left in the round, Henderson sprawls another takedown, but Rousimar stays focused and reshoots. Rousimar understands an important part of wrestling that I think gets overlooked in MMA. In MMA, wrestling is normally as simple as a guy trying a takedown, either he gets it or he doesn't, and if he doesn't, things reset to neutral. In amateur or freestyle wrestling, however, the shot is only the beginning of the battle. Jordan Burroughs, a national treasure and one of the pound-for-pound greatest ever, has made an entire career of just shooting blast doubles to initiate contact, and, often he does finish it, but even if he doesn't, he continues to scramble, often still getting the person down with an adjustment or secondary takedown. Wrestling is not just shooting takedowns. It's a lot of fucking shoving your head into places where it doesn't belong, and pulling your opponents, pushing them, etc. That's wrestling. We're seeing wrestling for MMA advance recently with chaining cage takedowns, but I absolutely love how Palhares doesn't give up here. I see so many people in MMA go in really deep on a takedown and just kind of get up when the first move they try doesn't work instead of trying to chain a second one. The second shot for Palhares allows him to get in deep, and he fucking power bombs the Olympian, dropping him into bottom full guard. Once again, Rousimar Palhares, BJJ specialist, power bombed Dan Henderson. He tries to throw ground and pound, and blocks an armbar attempt by Hendo by rolling for a leg. Eventually, he's able to escape the entanglement and get out. The next shot lands Palhares in a much worse position, Hendo beautifully hitting the turnover, but the Brazilian is able to get his face back and scrambles back up from front headlock. At the risk of this getting repetitive, but after all I am just saying what happened, a stuff shot leads to Palhares in the bottom of full guard. Palhares is trying to minimize damage, and Henderson is trying to make sure he doesn't get submitted, so it ends in a stand-up due to both stalling in the position. The third round is 4 minutes of striking and failed shot attempts until Rousimar tries to go for broke to avoid losing the decision rolling for a leg. Hendo defends intelligently, and while the Brazilian tries some more gremlin shit, time expires and Hendo wins the decision. It's worth noting that one judge gave Palhares the second round, which is honestly pretty amazing. Regardless of what can be said about Rousimar's character, given future accents, he's not a coward, and to fight Henderson like this took serious balls. It's no wonder people were so high on him as a prospect to me after watching this, as his wrestling isn't great but fundamentally sound, which makes his submission skills even more dangerous. A few fights later, Rousimar's picked up another loss to name Marquardt, but also a few victories, bringing us to his fight against Dan Miller in his home country of Brazil. After a minute of striking, Palhares pulls guard, grabbing double overhooks and dragging down his opponent with him. In an old-school gi jiu-jitsu move, he locks down one arm with an overhook while pushing the other one across to the other side to prevent him from blocking his hands, throwing up the legs for an armbar. Dan is able to jam his elbow into the inner thigh just in time, keeping the legs just open enough to get both inside and survive. Palhares makes a really interesting adjustment to try and finish the hold, first grabbing his own foot to prevent Miller from clearing it, and then figure four-ing his legs like a body triangle, attempting to basically brute force the arm lock with less than ideal setup. He goes belly down as a last resort but can't finish, and Miller uses strikes to break the grip and reset to open guard. Miller wisely stands up, having narrowly survived against a submission demon. Halfway through the round, Palhares staggers Miller off a front kick of all things, and quickly double legs him against the cage. Miller wisely keeps flailing and uses the kinetic energy to fling himself forward, securing his own takedown back into the dangerous guard of Palhares. The Brazilian employs a tactic I hadn't seen him use yet in a fight, attempting to enter knee shield off of a shrimp, but quickly bails on that to get back to feet on hips open guard. He attempts to use a bicep tie to set up the same overhook attack from earlier, but Miller knows what he's doing and stays safe before letting him stand up. With very little left in the round, Palhares drops Miller with another crazy kick. He beats the piss out of him and then walks off thinking he's gotten the KO. It's incredibly weird, because Herb was right there watching, but had made no movement whatsoever, indicating he was ready to stop it. This is Herb Dean after all, so it's very confusing decision making by the guy known for not letting up after he should have rather than before. The two are made to finish the round, and Palhares gets dropped but scrambles his way back up with a double leg via pure willpower. He ends the round on top and lands a late hit, perhaps making up for the weird near stoppage, and somehow has won the round given all that's happened. 15 seconds into the second round, and we get a great wrestling sequence as Palhares blitzes in for the high crotch and begins to lift Miller for a DC-style slam once again. Miller has a dumbass guillotine grip, but smartly adjusts and tries to stuff the head, hopping on one foot to attempt an escape. Palhares also adjusts, however, and finishes with a slick trip that I personally love, as a finish to the high crotch into full guard. Miller attempts a triangle but gets denied and slammed to the ground. Palhares tries to take the back as Miller stands back up, and a move I really love just fucking shoves Miller hard into the cage, blocking his forward and upward momentum. Perhaps from the slam or the shove, Miller looks incredibly hurt and grabs a single Anthony Smith style, which ends him back in guard as Palhares rains down strikes. The Brazilian commits an excellent cage grab whilst raining down blows, and there are points in this stretch where quite honestly it could have been stopped and possibly should have been. Miller attempts another triangle that ends in a slam, but ends up just getting beaten and bloodied for the rest of the round, and I would definitely score this as a 10-8 round for Rousimar. The third round is entirely a kickboxing battle, as both men are exhausted, and Rousimar wins by decision. I think this is an incredibly impressive performance by Rousimar, as if you didn't know he was a BJJ guy, you could be forgiven for mistaking him as a wrestler aside from the one guard pull, as his shots are fluid and chained to an intelligent series of attacks. His top game is really impressive, as rather than overcommitting to guard passing, he's content to take what Miller is giving him and just blast him inside his full guard. Obviously, just sitting in someone's guard with no intent to pass is pure stalling and pure grappling, but in MMA it's good strategy. Even though he's one of the greatest grappling minds ever, John Danaher would advocate that GSP not pass guard in his fights, either sitting in top half or full guard in order to control and punish his opponents. It might not be sexy, but it's winning, and that's what you're paid to do. This fight makes me deeply sad that Palhares is who he is, because if he combined this grappling with some refined striking, I could see this version of him making his way to a title shot in that era of welterweight or middleweight where the grappling was far less refined outside of GSP, Hendo, or Damian Maia. Versus Alan Belcher. While a knockout loss for Rousimar, there are some really interesting exchanges here I'd like to note, as Belcher is a fighter more willing to play in the realm of weird-ass grappling exchanges than most. 40 seconds in, Rousimar gets a single leg that he finishes with a crackdown, landing him in half guard. Belcher very smartly builds posture to avoid the pin and sits up, not quite achieving full octopus guard as he doesn't clear the right arm of Rousimar, but a position similar to it as he basically pins the arm of the Brazilian backwards. To avoid the back take, Palhares Granby rolls, but Belcher grabs a calf slicer from the truck position, a rarity in MMA I've only seen Chase Hooper do. It's my actual assertion that Palhares has such insane leg muscles that it aids in him not being finished here, as Belcher then switches to something even more goofy by attempting a twister. Palhares eventually muscles his way out and is able to roll for a leg, attacking a knee bar and then a heel hook in quick succession. Belcher escapes via something I mentioned in the intro, punching Palhares enough that his grip slips, and then figure fouring his legs to preemptively defend any more leg locks. Belcher even decides to go for a leg attack of his own, all while defending the heel hook. If you're not aware, when you're in a mutual ashi or a 50-50 leg entanglement, heel exposure is how you open yourself up to being heel hooked, no duh. A common defense used by Belcher here is simply hiding your foot with the other foot. He does leave a few openings, but not long enough for Rousimar to attack while still staying defensively responsible himself, as Belcher keeps either hiding, figure fouring, and just touching his heels together. Bailing once he can't get a look he wants submission-wise, Belcher strikes and takes top half guard, but Rousimar is able to re-guard back to full. Belcher keeps applying pressure and bonks the tree stump for a win via TKO. Honestly, I don't think Rousimar came in with a necessarily bad game plan here or performed poorly, but someone like Belcher, who comes from the Hayastan / Neil Melton grappling lineage, is always game to engage in any series of silly positions, quite honestly the sillier the better, and thus not someone he could mog with leg locks as easy. Hindsight is 20/20, and I'm once again Monday morning quarterbacking this, but Rousimar probably would have been more successful bailing on a heel hook almost immediately and trying to trade bonks on the feet, as the longer he stayed on the ground after failing the first heel hook attempt, he was going to get out-scrambled. Welcome one and all to the World Series of Fighting, the former name of the PFL, which served as a sweatshop for Ali Abdelaziz, who is explicitly in charge of the WSOF, whereas he just Palpatines the current promotion. Rousimar is here after being fired from the UFC for holding submissions too long, which is also how his tenure in this promotion will end. But of course I'm getting ahead of myself. Here he faces Steve Carl for the promotion's welterweight belt, basically being rewarded for getting fired with can crushing. Palhares lands a double leg before they even have the graphic for the clock up and lands in Carl's full guard. Carl grabs double overhooks and attempts a triangle, which proves to be his undoing. Rousimar pounces on the extended leg and falls backwards, going first into an ankle lock position before attacking the heel hook. This earns him the finish, and he holds it for about 3 seconds too long. Not much to say in that regard, aside from just that he couldn't change his behavior, which is incredibly unfortunate and disappointing, but predictable at this point. For the second to last fight of the study, we find ourselves watching our favored child of chaos versus his best opponent to date aside from Dan Henderson, former UFC welterweight title challenger John Fitch, a man fucked over by his perceived boring style in terms of earning big opportunities. After a minute of striking, Rousimar employs his familiar tactic of pulling guard out of a single leg, falling into his favored leg entanglement. He gets single leg X and tries to go belly down for the finish, but Fitch is able to turn back to facing him, and even throws some punches to attempt to loosen the grip. Fitch's leg is safe, and he has the solid idea of pushing on the left leg of Palhares, but he foolishly tries to spin out of the lock instead of beating it technically, something that should really only be a last resort. As he twists, he considers an ankle lock before committing to the motion, and the hesitation is a big part of what gets him finished. Rousimar holds the submission for several seconds too late, shocker. He's got exactly one last chance to not do that, and he's gonna burn it. For our finale, we have the fight that got Rousimar canned for the final time, though one that strangely has aged better than his other moral transgressions. Jake Shields is a piece of human garbage white supremacist. If you like him as a person, please unsubscribe. And thus I'm going to chalk this one up as a rare Palhares W. Delivering karmic justice definitely wasn't his intent. Our Brazilian friend was just doing his usual, but sometimes the blood god works in mysterious ways. And on this night, Rousimar was his righteous, veiny steroid arm of retribution. After about 20 seconds, Palhares pressures Shields into the cage and pulls guard with a really slick foot block, getting busy in an open guard, and Granby rolling twice to re-guard when he felt he was in danger of having his guard passed. Shields stays tight to his legs, trying to pass with strikes and pressure, and so Palhares moves up momentarily. Jake grabs a single, and Rousimar basically finishes it for him, rolling backwards once again into his own guard. It's kinda cartoonish how much work is being done in order to make no progress whatsoever, but it's so fun that I'm here for it. The man on bottom tries to work an overhook, possibly for an armbar attempt, but after eating some strikes rolls to his left side for a Kimura, allowing his guard to be passed to half. He almost immediately releases and gets smothered by Shields, who grabs a head and arm control, sprawling and smashing his opponent to the mat. His attempts to pass half are pretty rudimentary, however, and as he finally commits, he allows Palhares to re-guard. It's not as if this is a massive error or anything, but if you take a look, his right leg was stapling down the far right leg of Palhares. Instead of waiting to pass his left leg to the far side, he released prematurely in order to explode, and thus allowed the leg to become unpinned, and also let Palhares swing back to face him. It's a very easy mistake to make, and understandable when you're in a fist fight and not a pure grappling match. Palhares starts to realize he can't afford to stay on bottom for much longer in this state as ground and pound gets drained down on him, and so he starts to twist, seemingly reaching for the far side leg for a knee lever sweep before bailing, attempting a knee shield, and failing that, whipping his right leg over for an armbar. None of the attempts are particularly close to actually working, but it's rapid-fire, beautiful guard work that makes you remember that BJJ can in fact be quite cool. Shields passes to half guard easily and doesn't repeat his mistake in passing half guard, sliding into side control incredibly smoothly. Helping prove my pin-based conspiracy theories from my Yuri video, which you should absolutely watch if you haven't, Rousimar grabs an underhook, bucks, and spins like a torpedo to get back up. Shields almost immediately shoots in on a single against the cage and completes it well, as Palhares tries to ineffectually look for a double wrist lock on the far side, ending in side control. The Brazilian attempts to explode up but gets smothered as he bails to not give up his back, ending in pinned half guard. As he did before, he slowly and patiently slides his leg inside and back to re-guard before throwing elbows. A weirdly even striking exchange ensues as both men attempt to clobber each other, but at 30 seconds left, Shields hops over to pass to half once again. They exchange very silly strikes to end the round, and somehow despite losing the round, Palhares looks better than Shields, who sports some crimson eyeliner on his left side. To begin the second, Shields almost immediately shoots a double, and Palhares strangely seems caught a little off guard. He almost gets his back taken, but Granby rolls for the umpteenth time, getting the side control before re-guarding. To save you some time, Shields repeatedly passes to half before messing up and allowing his foe to re-guard, until finally with 2 minutes remaining passes to mount. The short legs of our tree stump betray him here, as a pass involves the aforementioned stapling that favors the man with the longer limbs. Aghast, Shields hugs Palhares and stalls until our friend just straight up gouges his eyes, leading to a warning before they resume. Shields half-heartedly looks for a head and arm, but fucks up as he postures to throw a ground and pound, with Rousimar hitting what's ostensibly a fucked up version of the TK scissors, using the same motion but with far less penetration, and he rolls for a leg. Shields is very close to being heel hooked, but expertly takes away the slack at the last second. If you're not sure what I'm talking about, I'll try to show you from the limited angle that we have to watch. It's hard to see, but he bends his right leg as the exchange begins, extending then contracting it once again to slip his way out. You can observe it best by the way his leg extends and then slips, looking at his foot. It's a very smart, disciplined defense, and Shields slips out to spend the rest of his time on top, winning another round. Both men look exhausted to begin the third, but Shields appears more compromised, completing a single leg, after a risky attempt by Palhares, but not able to hold him down at all. The two exchange some bus driver style striking intermixed with clinching for the next minute or so. Rousimar even counters one of those classic Anthony Smith style takedown attempts we talked about earlier by grabbing a cradle and spinning Shields down, landing some strikes before getting back up. Shield looks out on his feet, to be completely honest, and is probably only saved by how fucking tired Palhares also is. Exhausting what little he has left in the tank, Shields forces a double against the cage, but allows Rousimar to get his legs in. Palhares quickly grabs the double wrist lock and sweeps Shields over before finishing. It's honestly a beautiful sequence. What comes next is a little less so, as he holds a submission for several seconds too long, and Shields punches him after the horn. This would mark the end of Rousimar's career in major promotions, as he was quickly stripped of the title and fired by World Series of Fighting. Stings even more, given what a great fight it was, as maybe I'm not sure if the general audience loves this kind of fight, but I loved the grappling exchange, and he was on a very fun streak if you don't, include all of the submissions held far too long. When I first started this examination of Toquinho, I expected to find a few technical aspects that made the funny stuntman interesting, and add another layer or two to the demonic limb killer beyond the memes. What I found was far more disheartening. A legitimately good to great fighter who self-sabotaged his way out of stardom. Almost nothing is more depressing than squandered potential. As we note before we close, I found a Brazilian language interview where he talked about his childhood. From what I could understand via a Portuguese-speaking friend who summarized for me, the man's upbringing was hellish. He had to work as a very young child to survive and help support his family, basically had no meaningful education to speak of, and nearly starved to death multiple times. None of this excuses his behavior in the cage, but he's clearly a man with inner demons that dictate so much of what he's done over his career. He's suffered appropriate consequences for his actions within the sport, so all I can hope is that he finds inner peace someday. The man has inflicted as much damage upon himself as he has others, and unless he's a complete sociopath, I imagine that eats away at you. Palhares was a prodigy and the first horseman of the leglock apocalypse, and perhaps a future MMA leglocker can take the correct lessons from his game, pulling guard and or leglocks from takedowns rather than betting the house on Dark Souls iframe rolls. If you enjoyed this film study, consider subscribing and donating to my Ko-fi via the link in the description. I can't make any money of these videos, despite the popularity due to the fact that I'm using, copyright claimed footage, or buy a t-shirt, which should also be in the link below. Thank you, I love you, and moi, bye.
Okay, so Future Squill here with an addendum. I am recording this on Monday, and on Saturday, none other than the brother of Johnny Walker, Walter Walker, scored his third heel hook in a row in the UFC. He did exactly what I said people should do, by going for the takedown first and then going for the leg lock. And I then found an interview saying that he was influenced by Rousimar Palhares. So I guess I'm a smart boy. What can I say?